It was a night like any other. The rain fell steadily, a soft percussion on rooftops and windows, a sound meant to lull the world into a fragile sense of calm. But calm is deceptive, isn't it? Beneath its surface, there's always something waiting, something we choose to ignore because the truth is too unsettling to face. The story I'm about to tell begins on a night like this, a night when the rain was supposed to be nothing more than nature's melody. But for one person, it became something much darker. You see, when it rains, people believe they're hidden, protected by the veil of water that distorts sight and muffles sound. They think nothing can reach them in the comfort of their homes, surrounded by walls, locked doors, and glowing lights. But rain doesn't just fall. It moves. It carries things. Sounds, whispers, memories. Things that are not bound by walls or locks. Things that seep into places where they're not welcome. On this particular night, the rain wasn't alone. It brought with it something that had been waiting for far too long. Something that doesn't knock, doesn't call out, but simply arrives. The man in the story, Michael, thought the rain was a blessing that night. He welcomed it. The rhythmic tapping on his windows drowned out the silence of his empty home, kept him company while he sat in his favorite chair, sipping his tea, lost in thought. But then he noticed something, a sound that didn't belong, a faint knock at the window. Not loud, not frantic, but slow, purposeful. Michael froze, his cup halfway to his lips. His first thought was logical, as most of ours would be. The wind, a stray branch, maybe even the neighbor's cat. He stood, walked to the window, and peered through the rain-streaked glass. Nothing. Just darkness and the faint outline of trees swaying in the storm. Relieved, Michael laughed to himself, a nervous chuckle that he didn't fully believe. He returned to his chair, telling himself it was nothing. But the rain didn't stop, and neither did the knock. This time the sound wasn't coming from the window. It was from the back door. Michael's heart began to race, his skin cold, his breath shallow. He glanced at the clock. 2:37 a.m. Who could possibly be out in a storm at this hour? Grabbing his phone, he walked to the door, his footsteps echoing louder than they should in the stillness of the house. As he reached for the doorknob, his hand trembled. He hesitated. That was when he realized the knocking had stopped. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, suffocating. And then, as if on cue, the lights flickered. Once, twice, before plunging the house into darkness. Michael didn't move. He couldn't. The only sound now was the rain, but even that seemed different. It wasn't random anymore. It was steady, almost like footsteps. And then, from the corner of the room, he heard it. A whisper. Not a word, not a phrase, but a sound that sent a chill crawling up his spine. He wasn't alone anymore. Michael was a young college graduate, burned out from the constant noise and suffocation of city life. When the chance came to move into an old countryside cottage for a fraction of the price, it felt like a miracle. The cottage, nestled deep within a forest, was everything he imagined. Quiet, picturesque, and far removed from the chaos he was trying to leave behind. The nearest neighbor was miles away. The air carried the scent of damp earth and pine, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the occasional distant cry of an owl. But even as Michael settled in, the house had a stillness about it, as if it were waiting. On the second evening, after unpacking most of his things, Michael finally sat down to relax with his dog, Baxter, a loyal and cheerful German shepherd who rarely left his side. The rain had started again, heavier this time, beating against the roof and windows. As Michael sipped his coffee and stared into the fireplace, Baxter suddenly perked up, his ears twitching. He let out a low growl, the kind that made Michael sit up straight. "What is it, boy?" Michael whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. Baxter's eyes were fixed on the corner of the room, his growl deepening. Michael turned his head to look, but the corner was empty, shrouded in shadows. "It's just the rain," Michael told himself. Dogs hear things we don't. But as Baxter continued to growl, Michael couldn't shake the unease creeping up his spine. Later that night, as Michael was getting ready for bed, a loud, muffled knock echoed through the house. It wasn't the soft tapping of rain on glass. It was deliberate, heavy, and coming from the living room window. Michael's stomach tightened. The cottage was miles from the main road, and no one knew he lived here yet. Who would come to his house in the middle of a storm? Grabbing a flashlight, he made his way to the window, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. The knock came again. 3 slow, deliberate thuds. Taking a deep breath, he yanked the curtain aside and shone the light into the darkness. Nothing. Just rain streaking down the glass and the outline of the forest beyond. But then, just as he was about to step back, his light caught something. A set of muddy footprints on the porch, leading up to the window. The next morning, Michael woke up to a strange sight. Despite the heavy rain the night before, the ground around his house was dry. Yet the muddy footprints remained, leading from the forest to his front door and back again. As he stood there staring, Baxter barked sharply from inside the house. Michael rushed back in to find the dog growling at the back door. He opened the door cautiously, expecting to see some kind of animal, but there was nothing. No footprints, no movement. Just the forest, silent and still. Over the next 2 nights, the disturbances grew worse. The knocks on the window came again, louder this time, and always at the same hour, 2:37 a.m. Items began moving on their own. A chair that was against the wall the night before now sat in the middle of the room. His keys, left on the kitchen counter, were found on the floor in the hallway. On the 3rd night, as the rain poured down relentlessly, Michael awoke to the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth in the living room. His heart pounded as he reached for the flashlight on his nightstand. Baxter, who usually slept at the foot of the bed, was nowhere to be seen. As Michael stepped into the hallway, the footsteps stopped. The only sound was the rain, now accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to come from every corner of the house. Michael called out, his voice trembling. "Hello? Is someone there?" No response, just the rain, the whispers, and the oppressive silence in between. He turned to head back to his bedroom when he noticed something on the wall near the staircase. A message scratched into the wood, faint but unmistakable. "You're not alone." Michael's breath caught in his throat as the flashlight flickered, then went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. And then, for the first time, Michael heard it, low, guttural breathing. The rain outside continued to fall, but Michael's fear drowned out everything else. Michael sat in the kitchen that morning, staring at the scratched message on the wall. "You're not alone." His hands trembled as he sipped his coffee, trying to convince himself it had always been there, and he just hadn't noticed it. The rain was relentless, a constant backdrop to his growing unease. Baxter, usually playful and curious, refused to leave Michael's side. The dog stayed close, his ears twitching at every creak and groan of the old house. As the hours passed, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he turned his head, he half expected to see something or someone lurking just out of sight. But there was nothing, just the rain and the oppressive silence of the cottage. That night, as Michael lay in bed, the rain softened to a steady drizzle. For the first time in days, he thought he might actually sleep. Baxter was curled up on the floor, his rhythmic breathing a small comfort. But just as Michael's eyes began to close, a sound made them snap open. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakable, the sound of heavy boots on the creaky floorboards of the living room. Michael froze, his heart pounding so loudly he thought whoever, or whatever, was in the house could hear it. He reached for his phone and dialed 911, but there was no signal. The footsteps grew louder, moving closer to his bedroom door. Baxter suddenly stood, his hackles raised, teeth bared. A low growl rumbled from his throat, but he didn't move toward the door. Instead, he backed away, his tail tucked tightly between his legs. And then, the footsteps stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Michael strained to hear, holding his breath. Then a new sound, soft, almost imperceptible, replaced the footsteps. It was whispering, a chorus of faint, overlapping voices, speaking in a language Michael couldn't understand. The voices seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding him, suffocating him. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The house comes alive. The next day, Michael tried to dismiss the night's events as a product of his imagination. Sleep deprivation, maybe. Stress. But as he moved through the house, things started to change. A chair he'd pushed under the dining table was now in the middle of the room. The cupboard doors hung open, though he was certain he'd closed them. A framed photograph of his parents, which he'd placed on the mantel, was now face down on the floor, the glass shattered. Michael decided to check the wall again. The scratch message was still there, but it looked different, more jagged, more pronounced, almost as if someone had been adding to it. This time it read, "I never left." Desperate for answers, Michael decided to set up his phone to record the living room overnight. He placed it on a bookshelf, angled to capture the entire space, and left the lights on to make sure nothing would escape the camera's view. That night, the footsteps returned. They were louder this time, more erratic, moving quickly from one end of the house to the other. Baxter barked furiously, his growls echoing through the house. Michael didn't leave his bedroom. He couldn't. He sat on the bed, clutching a flashlight in one hand and a heavy wrench in the other, waiting for the noises to stop. By dawn, the house fell silent again. Exhausted, Michael retrieved his phone and began reviewing the footage. At first, the recording seemed uneventful. The rain fell steadily outside and the living room remained still. But then, at 2:37 a.m., something changed. The lights flickered briefly and a shadow appeared in the far corner of the room. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It moved, shifting slightly before stepping forward. The figure was tall and gaunt, its features obscured by darkness. But its eyes, they glowed faintly, two pinpricks of light that seemed to pierce the camera's lens. The figure didn't move toward the phone. It moved toward the hallway, toward Michael's room. Michael's stomach turned as he watched the shadow stop at his bedroom door. It didn't open it. Instead, it seemed to fade into the wood, disappearing completely. But the worst was yet to come. At 2:45 a.m., the footage shifted again. The camera angle hadn't changed, but now Michael could see himself, lying in bed, clutching his flashlight and wrench. And standing over him, staring down, was the shadow. It didn't move. It didn't touch him. It just stood there, watching, until the footage ended. Michael dropped the phone, his hands trembling. The image of the shadow over his bed was burned into his mind. The rain outside grew heavier, pounding against the windows like a relentless warning. Michael knew he couldn't stay in the house another night, but as he gathered his things, he heard it again, the whispering. This time it came from every direction, louder than before, and with it came a voice, deep and guttural, yet strangely clear. "You can't leave, Michael." The morning after reviewing the terrifying footage, Michael resolved to find out more about the house. There was no way he could stay there without understanding what was happening. The storm showed no signs of letting up as he drove into town, the rain pounding against the windshield, nearly drowning out the sound of the radio. He stopped at the town's library, a small, dimly lit building that smelled of aged paper and damp wood. The librarian, an older woman with piercing eyes, greeted him with a wary smile. When Michael mentioned the cottage, her smile faded. "You're staying there?" she asked, her voice low. Michael nodded. "Do you know anything about it?" The woman hesitated, then disappeared into the back room, returning with a dusty leather-bound journal. She placed it on the counter and slid it toward him. "This belonged to the previous owner," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He disappeared during a storm like this one, years ago. No one knows what happened to him. Some say the rain took him." Michael's heart raced as he opened the journal. The handwriting was shaky, the entries growing more erratic as they went on. The man wrote about hearing whispers in the rain, seeing shadows in the windows, and finding messages scratched into the walls, just like Michael had. The rain isn't just water. It carries something with it, something old, something that watches. It's always watching. If you're reading this, it's already too late. The rain never forgets, and it never forgives. Michael left the library in a daze, clutching the journal tightly. As he drove back to the cottage, the rain seemed different, heavier, more oppressive. It drummed against the roof of the car like a warning, each drop feeling like a nail driven into his resolve. When he arrived, the atmosphere in the cottage was suffocating. The air was damp, the walls seemed to close in, and every shadow felt alive. He tried to distract himself by reading more of the journal, but his eyes kept drifting to the windows. That was when he saw it. At first it was just a flicker, a faint movement in the rain-soaked glass. But as he stared, the figure became clearer. It was the same shadowy entity from the footage, its glowing eyes locked onto his. Michael stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. He looked at another window, and it was there too. Every window, every reflective surface in the house showed the entity, always staring, always watching. That night, the rain grew heavier, the sound almost deafening. Michael tried to barricade the windows and doors, but no matter what he did, the feeling of being watched never left him. He sat in the living room, clutching the journal like a lifeline, when he heard it. A voice, deep, guttural, and dripping with malice. "You shouldn't have come here." Michael froze, his heart pounding in his ears. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the walls, the floor, the air itself. "Who are you?" Michael shouted, his voice trembling. The response was immediate, chilling. "I am the rain." Michael couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the entity's glowing gaze, felt its presence pressing down on him. He tried to leave, but every attempt was thwarted. The car wouldn't start, his phone had no signal, and the rain made the roads impassable. He spent the night pacing the house, jumping at every creak and groan, every flicker of light. And then, just before dawn, the rain stopped. But the silence that followed wasn't comforting. It was heavy, charged with an unnatural energy that made Michael's skin crawl. He walked to the front door and opened it cautiously, peering out into the misty morning. The world was still, the air thick with moisture. But as he stepped outside, he realized the rain hadn't truly stopped. It had simply moved. The sound of water dripping, trickling, moving ever so slightly surrounded him. He looked down and saw his reflection in a puddle near his feet. But it wasn't his reflection. It was the entity, staring back at him, its glowing eyes filled with malice. Michael stumbled back into the house, slamming the door shut. His breath came in short gasps as he leaned against the door, his mind racing. And then he heard it again. The whispering. It was louder now, more insistent, and it came from every direction. The lights flickered, the walls seemed to pulse, and the oppressive silence was shattered by a final, chilling phrase. "The rain never leaves, Michael, and neither will you." The whispers escalated, filling every corner of the cottage with an unbearable cacophony. Michael pressed his hands to his ears, but it was no use. The voices weren't just sounds. They were inside his head, gnawing at his sanity. The windows trembled as if under an invisible pressure. The faint reflections of the entity in every pane, now fully formed, moving, closing in. Then the lights went out completely. Michael grabbed the journal, his only lifeline, and lit a candle with shaking hands. The flickering flame barely pierced the suffocating darkness, casting long, jittering shadows that seemed to crawl toward him. He flipped through the pages, desperate for an answer, and found it. To sever the rain's hold, you must face it where it's strongest, in the storm, where it was born. Only there can you banish it, but beware, for it will not let you go without a fight. The rain returned with a vengeance, a torrential downpour that felt alive, each drop striking the cottage with an almost malevolent force. Michael gathered what little courage he had left and opened the front door. The storm roared, wind whipping against his face, rain drenching him instantly. But this wasn't normal rain. It was ice cold, almost burning his skin, and it seemed to move with purpose, swirling around him as if it were alive. Clutching the journal, Michael stepped into the storm, his heart hammering in his chest. The whispers followed him, growing louder, more guttural, until they became an overwhelming roar. "Michael!" The entity's voice boomed, deeper and more terrifying than ever. "You cannot escape. You are mine." The storm's intensity nearly blinded Michael, but he pressed on, heading toward the clearing behind the cottage where the storm seemed to be at its most ferocious. Lightning illuminated the night, casting fleeting glimpses of the entity, its massive, shadowy form towering above him, eyes glowing like molten embers. The journal's instructions were cryptic, but one passage stood out. The rain feeds on fear. Confront it without terror, and its power will wane. Easier said than done. The entity lunged at him, its shadowy tendrils reaching out, grasping at his arms and legs. They were cold as death, pulling him toward a void that seemed to open in the ground, a swirling vortex of darkness and rain. Michael screamed, struggling against the pull, but the shadows only tightened their grip. Desperately, he recited the words from the journal, his voice shaking but growing louder with each repetition. The entity howled, its voice a mixture of rage and agony, and for a moment, the tendrils loosened. Michael seized the opportunity, pulling free and holding the journal aloft. "You don't control me," he shouted, the words more for himself than for the entity. "I'm not afraid of you." The entity recoiled, its form flickering like a flame in the wind. The storm around him began to wane, the rain's intensity lessening, but the fight was far from over. The journal's last instruction required Michael to confront the entity at its core, in the eye of the storm. With every ounce of courage he could muster, Michael stepped into the vortex, the rain swirling violently around him. Inside, the entity was fully formed, a monstrous figure of shadow and water, its glowing eyes fixed on him with pure hatred. Michael raised the journal and shouted the final incantation, a string of ancient words that felt foreign yet powerful on his tongue. The entity screamed, a sound so inhuman and deafening that it seemed to shake the very earth. Its form began to break apart, the shadows dissolving into the rain, the glowing eyes fading into darkness. Finally, with one last guttural roar, the entity exploded into a torrent of water, soaking Michael and leaving him alone in the silent, empty clearing. Michael stumbled back to the cottage, drenched and exhausted. The storm had passed, the night eerily calm. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by an unsettling stillness. He didn't stay to question it. Grabbing only his phone and car keys, Michael left the cottage, vowing never to return. The drive back to the city was uneventful, the sunrise a welcome sight after the harrowing night. He found a new apartment in the heart of the city, far from the countryside, far from the rain. For weeks, life seemed normal again, quiet, even peaceful, until one morning, when he woke to the sound of rain. Looking out the window, he saw the city bathed in sunlight, not a cloud in the sky. But the sound of rain persisted, growing louder, accompanied by a faint, familiar whisper. Michael's heart sank as he turned to face the room, the whispers now surrounding him. The rain never leaves, Michael. And neither will you. What Michael doesn't know is that the rain follows anyone who hears its whispers. Is it your turn tonight? Rain has a way of cloaking the world, doesn't it? A soothing melody for some, but for others, a harbinger of something far darker. Perhaps tonight, as you lie in bed listening to the rain, you'll start to wonder, is it just water on the window or something else trying to get in? Have you ever heard something strange during a rainy night? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear if the rain has ever whispered to you. Thank you for joining us tonight for another tale of terror. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like the video and subscribe for more spine-chilling narratives. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.